Welcome to the Startup Grind.
We invited Johannes from GetYourGuide, who kindly accepted. So we have him here. So first of all, I'd just like to give a warm welcome, a warm Startup Grind welcome to Johannes for taking the time to be with us. So without any further ado, we'll get started, and I'll start off by asking Johannes, in terms of starting up and getting into a startup, how did it all begin in terms of right at the beginning? Did you have entrepreneurial parents, or is it something that you've kind of picked up whilst at school? Did where you hear stories of people who say, well, I started off selling lemonade at a stand I created or something along those lines?
No. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks so much for being here. Typically, I always speak to audiences of 5 people, so this is a significant boost. And even my girlfriend typically can't listen to me for more than an hour, so please interrupt me and ask a lot of questions tonight. How we started was really, special, I think, in the way that, GetYourGuide, while we had this great vision of, becoming a great startup, we basically had no clue, and, it was never meant to be like a real business in the beginning. It was more like a side project at school. So it all originated in like 2008, 2009 when, like me and like a really good friend of mine with whom I was studying called Tao, who's a co-founder and still in the executive management team of GetYourGuide today. We're sitting over a dinner table and we're contemplating that, while it was really easy to book flights and hotels on the internet in 2008 and 2009, and there were many things, many websites to do so, it was actually really difficult to do great things in a destination and to really explore a destination. And we were back then, Tao was a physics student, I was a biochemistry student, I was actually in the lab doing, experiments with mice on like neurobehavior back then, so far from a travel background. And, just sort of like with that basic intuition, we thought it might be a great idea to actually have students around the world, so just like us, typically you see the world very much through your own lens, right? So that was how we thought about it, and we thought it was great to have students sign up as local tour guides, and we thought about students here in Zurich. We went to ETH Zurich. Students here in Zurich could actually sign up and log into the website and offer great tours of Zurich, whereas Tao, the other co-founder, thought about, I know so many people in China, and China is really difficult to visit, and tons of people, want to go to China. This was like 2007, right 2007, 2008 when we initially cooked up the idea, with the Beijing Olympics, etc., where we thought, it would be so great for like all these Chinese tourists to also log in and then show the world to, international people, international students that come into Beijing. So I think you're already getting my point that it's a very terrible idea. But anyway, so we launched the website, and we thought, this might be a massive sort of like new social network, and found out that actually no one logged in. There were like 3 tours that were created, or 5. And then I think we got to 100 tours, sort of like 10 months into it. We're still debating to the present day whether we got 3 or 5 bookings through the original platform of GetYourGuide. By the way, the original name was supposed to be Panda Tours because it was all centered around China. But when we thought that we could make it a little bit more international, we actually named it GetYourGuide, wisely so. And that's what stuck. And, we were really far from being, real entrepreneurs. I was at the time, I was just finishing up my degree. I applied for a PhD. I secured, a work contract with the Boston Consulting Group, which is like an American consulting firm. And, but what we realized back then doing that project, that totally failed, right? And it's sort of like, after 10 months, we just gave up and we're like, this is not working this way. What we realized is that, we were so much more passionate about doing this than anything else we had ever done in our lives before. And that was I think, sort of like the turning point when we realized, hey, there's this thing called entrepreneurship, and we actually had already done it a little bit, and we really like it. But it was not that we set out to be entrepreneurs or like do a startup or something. It was more like, hey, we do this project and we think it's really cool, and then over time it really turned into a real company. And that was when and that was then the second step when we went back to the drawing board and said, hey, this thing about like creating this student community for tour guides is maybe not the right way to approach it. Maybe we should see the business in a different lens. And we realized that a lot of, professional suppliers of sightseeing tours and activities, starting with the, Zurich river cruise, or with the, with the sightseeing tours, or, with the glacier lifts, that all those guys suddenly started writing us emails and said, hey guys, GetYourGuide is great. We heard about it in the press. Can you guys sign us up and like promote us, and we'll give you money for it? And, we went back, to our existing platform of the student tour guides and counted that we just made 10 Swiss francs over the past 8 months or so. And then those guys, offered us hundreds of Swiss francs right away. And we're like, wow, this is like an incremental revenue stream here. And, then we thought about, maybe we can add them to our portfolio of student tour guides. And then we had long winding strategy sessions and discussions whether, this was okay for our community of probably 50 people or not. And then we finally said, okay, let's do it. So let's pivot the model. And we literally, Tao and I rewrote the entire business plan over a week and a half, and really dug into this market of, things to do globally, and realized it's huge. And then the penny just dropped, and we were like, wow. And it's like, we have to shift the platform. And then we took all the technology, that we had built so far, and the business plan, and then something magical happened for us, I have to say. The Zurich Cantonal Bank back then just handed us money, more or less, because they had heard about the project. And, they handed us like a seed check, based on this initial prototype and the business plan, which was really looking back, I have to thank these guys. I would have never invested in that project at this stage. But we got lucky and we got the money, and that really helped us to really actually quit our jobs and work full time on it. And we went all in, and I don't think we cared about the risk back then. We didn't even it was so clear that this had to work, right? And then things took off from there. But it took me, I guess, 1.5 years to realize that I'm an entrepreneur.
That's interesting. The next question would be kind of related to making that decision, because obviously, as you said, you had an opportunity to work with a global consultancy firm. The other guys were working on PhDs, and obviously had a what would be classed as a bright career ahead of them. Making that decision to walk away from Boston Consultancy Group and kind of come together with these 5 guys and work on a startup that may or may not fail. What made you kind of make that decision? What was the thought process that was going through your mind when you thought, okay, I'll walk away from this and work with these guys?
But to me, it was interestingly, there was 2 things involved. I would say the number one thing was that I realized that I didn't care so much about earning a big salary, which was a very interesting realization that I had. All the way throughout my student life, I was supported by my parents, thankfully. Didn't have to work, but I was also not super wealthy, right? I mean, I was just getting by every month, and my bank account was always going towards the black numbers is sort of like, at the beginning of the month, and then back into the red, and then so like it went back and forth, and then suddenly, when I sort of like started the first months at BCG, and suddenly I was earning a very good salary, and I could buy all the things I always wanted to buy, and then I could go out and eat every night. And I realized that, after sort of like a couple of weeks, that, while that was great, I actually didn't care that much about it. And at the same point of time, I realized that, the work I was doing there was great, but I wasn't really passionate about it. It was not like I was really looking forward to getting to work every day. It was more like I was really looking forward to Friday afternoon and sort of like leaving work and like going into the weekend. And, after a while I figured it's actually really stupid to sort of like spend 80% of your life in something sort of like where you spend 80% of your life to actually achieve or like enjoy the other 20%. That's like a weird, mix of your life spent, right? And then, at the same point in time I realized that, like the company, the project back then that I was working for was just something that I really, really loved, and I really enjoyed going there every morning. And that was when, sort of like I sort of like went back and said, sort of like, let's take the risk. I mean, like, what can happen to me? And I was in a very fortunate situation. Obviously, I wasn't like, I'm not married, don't have kids, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have all these obligations. That it was sort of like a no-brainer for me then to say, let's try it, let's go all in, let's do the startup, because at the end of the day, this is what I'm really passionate about, and I think that's like the most important thing. That being said, so like, because this is a talk for entrepreneurs, right? Just like, I wasn't made for consulting, for instance. I don't think I was ever a really good consultant, and that business model never really appealed to me. And I guess I'm a good entrepreneur, or was at least lucky to sort of like grow into one. On the flip side, not everyone is a great entrepreneur either, and you also have to, because today all the hype is about entrepreneurship. When we started, wasn't as much, but today everyone wants to do a startup. A startup is not for everyone, and not everyone is really passionate about startups too. So like you have to really think about, am I really passionate about the nuts and bolts of that stuff? And there's also a lot of ugly stuff in startups and a lot of demotivating stuff in startups as well. And I think that's sort of like the sort of like the coin you have to flip when you're making the decision.
Now, obviously, moving on from making the decision, you then put all your energy into making GetYourGuide a success. With the funding that you'd got from Zurich Cantonal Bank, which, if I'm not mistaken, was 500,000 francs, something like that.
No, it was much less than that. It was 175,000 Swiss francs. And we actually survived on that in Zurich for, I think, 8 months or something with like 5 people. I still have no clue how we did that, but really, I have no clue.
I was actually wondering, do you still eat ramen?
There's a really, really good ramen place right down the street from where I live, but
you mentioned you started doing that phase. That's pretty much the only thing you guys ate.
Yeah, exactly. So we were like, we actually had a ramen place that was, or actually it still exists, that was quite cheap, very close to Technopark, where we started. Yeah, I mean, like, I won't lie. I mean, like, we weren't like, it weren't great times financially back then, and we certainly weren't rewarded, of our sort of like early successes in the startup life, and sort of like, going out to fancy restaurants and eating sushi every day. But, it's like at the end of the day, we also didn't have time for that. So, we were constantly working, basically. I was literally living off of Coop and Migros and stuff like, was constantly working. I was, not eating, barely sleeping. It was really very, very intense.
So, by that, you've been quoted in saying that you're a firm believer in bootstrapping, and obviously by your testament here, you definitely lived the life. But when did you get to the point where you realized that, okay, we have to take in funding, and what was the kind of thought process behind saying, okay, let's look out there for funding to build this company?
Well, so like discounting the ZKB investment, which was funding, but was more like, sort of like actually being able to quit the job and, sort of like live, So like if you think about our first investment round, which we did towards the end of 2011, so 1.5 months into the company, 1.5 years into the company, which we raised from Pro-Founders Capital, which is a smaller sort of like, seed early stage venture capital fund. Back then we raised $2 million, which was the first substantive amount. And, I would consider that the real first funding round in terms of getting investment. The thought process behind that, and interestingly enough, it's a very good question to ask, because we argued heavily between the founders whether we should do that or not. Because we thought, sort of like we were in bootstrapping mode, so we were sort of like, financing our own expenses. And at the same point in time, we knew that the road would fork afterwards. Either we were going into the track of making this a global success, and which means sort of like being tied in for the next 8 to 10 years and working very hard and sort of like investing into growth, or we would go down the more regular track. If you want, so like the world is not all VC capital, right? Although so like we entrepreneurs sometimes tend to think that. So like, or go down the regular track and sort of like live a healthy lifestyle and enjoy our time with our friends and sort of like raise families and all that kind of stuff. But the thought is like the argument that won was that you only get once in a lifetime opportunities so often. And when you get them, you better take them. And that's what we did. And, I don't think there's like a single second in my life or the lives of my co-founders where we regret that decision.
Okay, cool.
But we did think about it, and we discussed it heavily.
Okay. And taking money from Pro-Founders, what was the decision behind going with them rather than any other VC? Would it be anything to do with the people who are involved, such as Brent
Hoberman? Yeah, I have to say Brent sold me for sure. He's a great Brent Hoberman. For those of you who don't know him, he's very well known in the UK. He founded lastminute.com, which is a British travel agent, and it's like scaled internationally. And I would say that next to the Queen of England, he's probably like the most well-connected guy in the country. It's insane. He's done a lot for GetYourGuide in terms of growing me professionally, and then also connecting us to the ecosystem. And a lot of our later successes, I think, can be attributed to him and the team. How we picked those guys, was obviously because of that networking capability and that, sort of like growth mentality and the trust they put in us. But the process that we went through, and I would highly encourage that to anyone who's building a company, the process that we went through was really, number one, is sort of like not only like we didn't only get a term sheet from Pro-Founders, we got a term sheet from many people. And we did that for our subsequent Series A round last year as well. So we got tons of term sheets, and we let those guys pitch against each other. And what I did, what I always say, so like the first thing that I say to a VC actually is, before you send me the term sheet, send me the contacts to all the people in your portfolio. And so like all the portfolio CEOs, and let me talk to them, particularly the ones that failed, because I want to find out whether you are someone I want to work with as well, because it's always a mutual thing, right? Your investor can actually get rid of you much easier than you can get rid of your investors. So you have to make sure that it's a balanced relationship. And I did a lot of diligence on all the VCs that invested in GetYourGuide. I spent, literally, for each VC that invested in us, I spent at least a week, calling tons of people and stuff, like really making sure that it's a proper VC. And I did that for all the other guys in the competitive process as well. And I let them know that I was doing that. And following to that, what I also always did is I called the VCs in, and I let them present to our entire company. So I told them, hey guys, and stuff like, you want to invest, or like, you're interested in GetYourGuide, come and see us, and we present to your partnership, right? But you also have to present to our partnership, right, which is the company. And then, I let I briefed all of our employees, and, I told them which questions to ask. So they were all asking the nasty questions, like, do you really want to invest in GetYourGuide? Do you think Johannes is a great guy? But, and that, that is very helpful. I think most entrepreneurs are too fearful of venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are people like you and I. And, sort of like you have to deal very professionally with them, and you have to make sure that those guys are in a competitive process. I think that's like most entrepreneurs let themselves lure into this myth around, sort of like the great VC that helps and is great, well connected and has this great reputation, et cetera, et cetera. I would look at a VC always like a financial investor, first of all, because that's what they are, and make sure that you're going with the right financial investor. It's, sort of like picking your banker, right? You want to have someone whom you can really trust, who go through you, also with you also through the dark times, and, someone you can always call up, in the middle of the night, and someone you want to go out and drink a beer with, right? Those are sort of like the key criteria, and that your team also can work with very professionally. So I think those are like the key criteria that you have to look after.
That's interesting. Okay, next question. You get the 2 million in funding. You've got this big check in the bank. What do you do then? What did you have a clear plan to say, okay, we get this amount of money and we're going to use it for this, this, and this? Or was it a case of, okay, let's get the money and then we see how we utilize it as opportunities come up?
So whenever you raise funding, it's typically also because you're very short on cash. So the first thing you always do whenever you get a funding round and is like actually paying all the outstanding bills. I think that's the number one thing that we did. And then afterwards, I think for every funding round, we actually went out to a really great dinner with the entire team. And that's how we spent the money. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, I mean, like you go into the pitch and you have a very clear allocation, right? So like you go in with your P&L and you say, hey, you invest in us, and we sort of like take the investment and sort of like put that capital to work into in the company. And you always sort of like, typically you make very clear whether that is sort of like in product development, meaning hiring engineers, whether that means more sales, whether that means more marketing dollars to sort of like, get a better consumer brand. And you really sort of like, you want to think about that actually before you take the investment. So we had a pretty detailed strategy for every individual round for, so like what would happen in the next, so like 1, 2, 3 years afterwards. And, at GetYourGuide, I think one of the things that, makes the company very special and also is totally abnormal. It doesn't only have to do with great management. Is that we always hit or like exceeded these plans. And but sort of like that is I've also invested in a couple of other companies, and I've seen those companies grow, and that is not the norm. Typically you want to make these plans and then also prepare for when it's not going as well, and stuff like then make scenarios. Like, I think that's the key job of the CEO. You always have to know, so like what's my sort of like, mid case, best case, worst case, what do I do? What are the scenarios that I'm dealing with? And you want to be sure that you check those scenarios with your investor, and then have a proper roadmap of what you do after the funding. I mean, like when the money comes into the bank, that's actually the first day of your execution plan and your roadmap.
But as you know, life happens. So, I mean, things happen in terms of, I think when you took your 2 million funding, this is a time when the world was going through an economic tough time. Did you have a lot of pressure on you thinking about, okay, what if our kind of worst case, because of what's going on, is not even close to what we're going to experience? Did you have that kind of mental pressure on you, or this is something that was mitigated by all the plans you had?
No, I never. I mean, like I always had mental pressure of, I guess, of stuff like growing the company. I never looked at, I would say macroeconomics too much, because at the end of the day, you can't change it. And I think if you have a great company and a great product and a great vision and great leaders and great growth, you will always be able to raise cash. VCs often make that argument in order to pressure you into signing a term sheet, that they say, so like the economic outlook. And I've literally heard that from the first sort of like, funding round of GetYourGuide. I've always heard that argument, the capital markets are going to dry up, so like you'll be out of cash, you have to take as much money, so like let us invest. And so like that's sort of like the only way to go. Look, at the end of the day, the VC market, obviously, particularly in the US, has dried up during certain periods where it was more difficult to raise cash. But, guess what? Sort of like Google and Facebook, sort of like were built, and sort of like, also funded, right sort of like during the .com bust, or sort of like right after it. So, even during the nuclear ice age, a couple of like really good companies were created. It definitely sort of like plays into valuation. I agree, but I would never think too much about these kind of factors. So like you just have to go after the plan of your company and whatever is best for your company, and the external factors you have to take into consideration. But I would never sort of like devise my funding strategy after macroeconomics. I think that's ludicrous, and it can only sort of like be bad.
So kind of moving on from that, I know you then kind of made some strategic alliances with certain companies in the travel industry.
Yeah, like TripAdvisor.
TUI. What was your decision behind going with these specific players rather than any other?
Well, we got contacted, sort of like as soon as we grew to a certain size, and sort of like we got a little bit more into sort of like the B2B press. And that's something that I would encourage for all of you guys. I think something that you should always push for is actually realizing which industry you're working with, and where the big players of this industry are sitting, which geographies they're sitting in, and then sort of like pushing a little bit towards more press mentions, and so like getting some visibility, combined with very strong business development. And a very clear business development plan. I think that is sort of like how you get the key partnerships. And for us, the key partnerships were really instrumental in our success because, they brought us a lot of leads and revenue, but even more so, they got us a lot of visibility, nationally and internationally. For instance, when we signed TripAdvisor, our supplier sign-up rate, so suppliers wanting to list on GetYourGuide just went through the roof, right? Suppliers couldn't wait any longer to sort of like, sign up and list with GetYourGuide, and also, sort of like there was a pretty good consumer uptake through TripAdvisor, but then also sort of like through the general consumer press that we got off the deal. So this was a really beneficial deal, for instance, for us. But I would say that, a word of caution as well, while those things were great, and particularly also for funding, by the way, those partnerships helped a great deal because that showed that there were larger companies interested in GetYourGuide, which again, sort of like for a money guy, for a VC, always means, wow, that's a potential acquirer someday. While that is all great, I think the key point of advice that I can give you is never base your growth strategy around, a few strategic partnerships, because it's not going to work. The strategic partners are incentivized to learn from you and help you grow to a certain extent, but they are never incentivized to make you really big, right? I mean, sometimes that happens, like the AOL Google deal, for instance, where AOL sort of like partnered with Google, sort of like, and let Google power their search, and thereby sort of like grew Google really big. Is an example, but generally, that's not the norm. I would highly encourage to get strategic partnerships, and they can have great value, but I think your primary focus should always be around your core product. I think that's something that I really learned over the years, and I made the mistake on numerous occasions that I was devoting too much time to partners and too little time to our own product.
And kind of related to that question is, I don't know whether this is fact, but I know at quite an early stage you were offered by a Swiss-based travel company in terms of for them to acquire you, and obviously you turned that down. Is that a fact or something?
I don't know what you're talking about. No, I mean, like we got a couple of offers throughout the entire history of GetYourGuide. But I would say the good thing is that we were so passionate about the business that the key thing we always have been thinking about was really sort of like, how can we grow it bigger, and how can we make this like once in a lifetime opportunity, and we weren't. I think it was very, very cool of the entire team that we didn't sell out earlier, although we could have. And this takes massive guts, because literally, I just told you how my bank account went from sort of like, black in the beginning of the month to like red. And this sort of like went through the entire first years of GetYourGuide. And so like we all never had cash, right? So like we're barely living, sort of like on plus minus zero, and then turning down, a deal that, could make you rich, or like reasonably rich overnight takes a lot of guts. And I have to give a lot of credit to the team that we've always been so inspired to do Get Your Guide that we never thought twice about these kind of things.
That's quite interesting. Because would you ever advise an entrepreneur who started a company to take the money and run, in terms of just depending on the situation?
It totally depends on what you believe in the company is. If your gut, that is like a gut feeling thing, right? At the end of the day, you can only know so much. You can look at the market and how the market develops. You can look at your own sort of like burn rate and sort of like how your product develops and sort of like the motivation of your employees and the business plan and the funding opportunities. There are a lot of indicators that tell you whether you should think about selling the business or not. I think generally selling a business successfully is a great thing. There are only very few entrepreneurs who've been capable of doing that. And I think that's something that, sort of like, so it definitely deserves respect. But at the end of the day, I think the most important part about sort of like an M&A process is that you actually do not want to be independent any longer. I think that's, and you can, I would say the only way to determine that is that you see a better opportunity of your company in the hands of someone else, whereas you don't see as good of an opportunity, staying independent.
Now coming back to a question related to the M&A, you've acquired Gitsy and also I Got a Guide. What was the thought process and kind of what made you go for these specific companies as acquisitions?
Well, generally there were a ton of companies in the entire, I would say, tour guide space. I would sort of like call it peer-to-peer and also B2C, sort of like destination services / activities space or tour guiding space. And a lot of those companies, have had a very tough time. I think at Get Your Guide, we've been able to, very early get a very unique model in the market and then scale it and be successful, which was great for us. But, also was in a way very lucky. And I think the timing was just right and we had the right team in place. Not every company was that lucky, but that also means that the teams were not necessarily bad or worse than we were. Just on the opposite. Gitsy was a clear case where we were super interested in actually working with the team. And I actually, I sat together one day with the CEO of Gitsy, Adriel Decker, who now sort of like leads our mobile product development, and was at a great Italian restaurant in Berlin, and we really sort of like discussed, the future of Get Your Guide and the future of Gitsy, and we were clear, we clearly came to the conclusion that it was not very useful for Gitsy to develop something on the sidelines where our visions were so similar in the long term, where it made much more sense to actually sort of like combining our forces and working on one project. And we literally, we discussed all these options, it was not even, I wasn't even going to the dinner with the intent of doing that or with the intent of really talking about that. And, it just became so clear to both of us that, after I think the third bottle of wine, we were like, this is amazing. And the next morning I woke up and was like, what weird conversation did I have last night? But I called him up and was like, should we really continue that discussion? And he was like, yeah, I think that's the right thing to do. And because he figured out that, and that his team, so like as we sort of like then went along the process and did the diligence on the team and really talked a lot about, our vision of the combined entity later on, his team had the same vision that, Gitsy independent was not as valuable as Gitsy with Get Your Guide. So in that case, being independent was not as valuable as actually being owned by another company. And for Get Your Guide, on the flip side, it was really valuable to have the Gitsy team in the company and their know-how and their tech and their drive. And so it made a lot of sense for us to do the acquisition. And it turns out that, while I was totally afraid in a way that this would all go wrong because I had heard so many, terrible stories around acquisitions. that I was totally surprised how well it went afterwards. We had, so like the past half year has been a honeymoon period without an end, and we've built a lot of great products together that will surface in the next couple of months. I think you guys will be amazed if you continue looking at GetYourGuide and the products that we pump out, that there will be a lot of really good stuff.
Now, coming into expansion, you started off here in Zurich at the Technopark, then Berlin, now you're Las Vegas. What made you decide Berlin? What made you decide Las Vegas in terms of locations?
Yeah, I could give you like a really great story now, but I think I should be honest, although this is very personal, only between you and me and YouTube, right? But no, literally, we were all students at, all the co-founders and the early executive management team were all students at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and thus we created the company here in Zurich, and we hired the tech team here in Zurich. But then when we scaled the company, we realized that, it's actually very hard for a marketplace company like GetYourGuide to actually scale all the customer service and the sales in Zurich. And this was basically our entire thought process. We didn't think about many other factors. It was more like, shoot, like we can't really afford this here in Zurich, but we have these customer calls. And at the time, and I kid you not, the way how customer service worked, this was like, after 12 months after launching the website, was that all of the founders had a phone redirect, during the night. And I was literally called up, sort of like every second night by some sort of like customer, and so like woke up and ran to my PC and was like, "Oh, you want to book? That's amazing! Wait!" So like I'm almost there, and it's great. By the way, I learned a lot doing customer service. All of you guys, like if you have like some sort of company that is consumer facing, I can only encourage you to do customer service. It's probably like the most rewarding thing we're making all of our management do customer service at GetYourGuide. I think it's a very important thing. Even if you work in a bank or a consulting company, go and work in your customer service department if you can, and like tell your supervisors to sort of like let you do that, because you learn so much about the company there. All I learn about GetYourGuide today is in customer service, because that's when I talk to our real consumers. But we realized that, hey, this is really difficult, and we're all doing that ourselves and picking up the phone every night, and that doesn't really scale, right? And as we were getting to more and more traffic, we realized that we want to find another solution, and hiring people in Zurich was just not an option because we couldn't afford it. And then I went on a trip to Czechoslovakia and like all the Eastern countries to sort of like set up something there, and realized that it's really difficult. Like I didn't speak the language. I constantly felt like I was getting ripped off, and like it was probably I was, and it was like also like the culture is so different. It's going to be so hard to manage it from Zurich, that in the end we looked at Germany and Eastern Germany and sort of like decided between Dresden, Leipzig, and Berlin, and so like went over to Berlin and sort of like fell in love with the city right away. And how can you not, right? It's a great city, and there's so much entrepreneurial talent and so many people. So we went over to Berlin and literally hired like 20 interns there, which was a terrible idea, but we did, and those guys took over the customer service. And also sort of like we started building up sales there, and we sort of like hired a guy to sort of like do that, and those were like the early days, and this is how we like going to Berlin in the beginning only had sort of like the sole purpose of relieving us from the stress of doing customer service and sales or acquiring new suppliers onto the platform. Las Vegas came shortly afterwards. When we did the TripAdvisor deal, we looked at each other and were like, awesome, we got this deal signed, and now we get tons of traffic from the US, right? So who's going to do the customer service in the US, right? This means staying up even later at night. And, we figured this is not going to work. We need to have some people in the US. So what I did is we had one freelancer doing sales at the time in Las Vegas, and she was really good. And she's actually still the leader of our Las Vegas office today. And I booked a flight over to Vegas and stayed there for 2 months and set up the customer service team. Can you believe staying for 2 months in Las Vegas? So it was total madness. I actually slept in a hotel that had a casino downstairs. I was walking through it it was crazy. Well, those were the greatest days of the entire ride. I totally, I so dig these days. I mean, that was amazing. We did, interviews with call center reps, the freelancer, that we had hired there, and I in a Starbucks coffee, and had all these sort of people, living I never had seen an American work contract before either, and suddenly I was handing out some, right? It was really fascinating, and we really learned a lot in a short period of time. But again, stuff it was, looking back, it was a very opportunistic move where we just wanted to have a destination that has very cheap labor costs that we could afford and that could do customer service and sales. That's how it got started. What turned out later on for the case of Berlin is that Berlin not only has great customer service and salespeople, but and affordable ones, but at the same point in time, Berlin has a fantastic startup ecosystem and is a very international city with a huge entrepreneurial spirit, and very importantly, is livable for a foreigner without speaking German, which is true for Zurich as well to an extent, but Berlin is even much more so because the communities of expats are just much bigger. It's very attractive towards expats, again, because of the city life and the urban atmosphere. And you can even recruit people from the US or from the UK there. And last but not least, and that is a very major point that we realized over time, as you grow and want to attract better and better talent, and it's not only about price anymore, it's also about competition with other employers. And having, people like Google or Microsoft or IBM or UBS or Roche or Novartis competing with you for talent is a much different ball game than having SoundCloud or Vuga or startup XYZ compete with you, because those guys, we were all in the same team, right? And so at the end of the day, the offers all look the same, and the employee really just chooses for whichever company he's most passionate about. In other destinations like San Francisco, New York City, or even Zurich, I would say it's the same thing. The problem for employees is always, do I really want to go to the small, not known startup and earn less and potentially even not have a job in a year, versus working for Google, where I work for one of the best employer brands in the world with a massive salary and all the greatest office, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something that is really underestimated by a lot of startups is, how competitive is your ecosystem for hiring? Because if it's not as competitive, you will be able to attract a lot better talent, which in turn will make your startup a lot more successful on average.
Now, coming back to a question related to that, it's about the culture of the company and how that kind of is transferred across. Obviously now having offices in Berlin, having offices in the US, how have you been able to transfer what you have here in Zurich to those different locations?
That's a very good question. That is the most difficult part of growing a company, particularly if you have several offices, is getting the culture right. And I think number one is that in each of these offices, you have to have those seeds, basically. You have to have people that totally live and breathe and know the culture and are not just some hired guns, right? You have to have that. Otherwise, the office is hardly going to be successful. That is number one. So you have to have those drivers leading those different offices that are totally into the company culture and know how to build it and know how to scale it. Number two is, that is the prerequisite, I guess, even to number one, is that you have to have a very clearly defined company culture. So we actually went down to the extent that when we opened Berlin and grew Berlin and saw that culture was getting more and more important, and it was very difficult to have a homogeneous culture across different offices. we actually sort of like went to the extent that we wrote down what we thought, had made us successful to that point. So we brainstormed with all the employees and sort of like came down with a couple of core values and really defined them in great depth. So like, what does that mean? So like, why? It's like, why are we having these core values? What are they? So for GetYourGuide, I can give you a couple of examples. Our core values are, for instance, we are very passionate about what we do. We improve every day. We are open and honest. We help each other grow. This is like a really important one. So we always have the core value that, if you do something, for yourself and improve your KPIs, you're a hero. If you help someone else, you're a superhero. So we improving honesty, collaboration is really important for us. And then the last one is we make each other smile. So we also bring something more to the workplace than only our hardcore deliverables. And those core values might sound very fuzzy to you, and that is probably, if you don't know the company, core values typically tend to be very intangible stuff that you don't really, everyone is passionate about what they do, everyone values results, right? Everyone is open and honest, everyone tries to improve, and everyone makes each other smile. But it's really in the application of the core values where the magic happens. So, when we say we're really passionate about what we do, it actually means that we fire people who aren't passionate about what they do. To sort of like bring it to the most drastic level. And, if we say that we are very open and honest, it also means that, we don't hire someone who's not totally open and honest, or we don't get the feeling, or our reference checks don't, say that, he's always been totally open and honest and sort of like straightforward in the past. Although, he might be an engineering rock star who comes from Google, right? So we are very, very anal about our core values. We have performance reviews on a quarterly basis where we actually grade every single employee and every single core value and give extensive feedback on how the employees performed in that core value area. So, for instance, if someone was very active in the company and sort of like spurred the passion of other employees by, for instance, organizing a retreat, or by sort of like, setting up specific workshops, that would be like a really big upgrade in the sort of like in the passion category, right? Or if someone, sort of like, for instance, also, was very open and honest and sort of came up to the supervisor and criticized, some things in a very constructive way, that would be very positively rewarded and in that category. So we're very, I would say, that's also one of the very specific things about our company, right? That's number two. We value results. We're very result oriented. We're very metric oriented at GetYourGuide. We're very engineering heavy because we were all engineers when we started, and we ingrained that into the DNA of the company. And to the present day, we make sure that DNA is very much held up. And anyone that, who doesn't fit with that DNA, we don't hire, or, if we hired him, we actually sort of like let go and send off to other opportunities. But I think this is sort of like in our entire HR and hiring process has been huge. And we've been extremely conscious of it from day one. I can only recommend to every startup, the culture of your company is what makes you successful or not successful. Every successful company had a great, or at least very unique and distinct culture. Culture also doesn't always have to be pleasant. A culture is not whether you have yoga chairs, or whether you have, dogs in the office, or whether you, cater your dinner, or whether you have a great espresso machine. That's not culture. That's features. Culture is really what, at the end of the day, your employees will tell their friends about, what the work atmosphere is like. That's the culture. What they really think, what they can achieve there. Why they're there. So like why, the best way to find out about a culture is, to ask someone, why are you doing Startup Grind, for instance? What differentiates Startup Grinds to sort of like, any of the other events that are out there, right? That's the culture. So like then you get to the core and the culture of Startup Grind, as one example. And it's always surprising to me how few people can actually answer that question for their own companies that they work for. Now, I'd highly encourage you to ask people that you meet sort of like what the culture of their workplace is like, whether they could define it in a couple of words. And it's always, and it's typically, those are not the things that are written in like the culture guidebooks, right? Whenever I sort of like, meet people and they really tell me about the culture at UBS, it's very different to like the PowerPoint slides that you see, sort of like in the corporate press office, right? And, granted, UBS is a huge, sort of like a huge company, and there are tons of different cultures probably within the company. But I think those kind of things are really, still very poorly understood in terms of building companies and running companies, and they are still so instrumental to it. They were very instrumental to the success of GetYourGuide.
Okay, now moving on from that, you get funding for 14 million at the beginning of the year, and obviously that means expansion. What are your plans for the future in terms of new products, new markets? Where do you see GetYourGuide in 10 years, for example?
10 years is always a very difficult question for a startup. Let me put it that way. I think at GetYourGuide we currently have a great opportunity to build the largest single platform for people to find and book things that they can do. Be it sightseeing tours or museum entry tickets, or anything you can do in a city or in a destination. And I think that vision is very big if you really think about it. Think about all the things you can do here in Zurich today. I mean, there are vast amount of things that are bookable and are transactionable, and so like you can do. And I think being the one destination platform worldwide to actually find and book these things and explore and plan, whether it's on vacation or in your own city, I think that's a very, very big mission. And I think that sort of like to come close to actually fulfilling that dream of if sort of like, I guess at one day, when you ask me or I ask you, what do you want to do today? And you're like, you take out your mobile phone and say, let's check GetYourGuide and let's make sure that, we find something amazing to do together today. I think growing into that vision is what really motivates us. And I think that actually doing that will still take many years because it's a very daunting challenge, and it has there's a lot of groundwork required to actually go to that to that level of, I would say, natural consumer behavior where it really makes sense, because we have all the products and we have all the technology and we all have all the consumer eyeballs. But so like that's, I guess, what I would sort of like honestly answer, sort of like what I think about in terms of the long time frame. But and so like while you have this long time frame and long time horizon and the bigger vision, I think you also always have to be conscious of what comes next year and what comes next month and what comes sort of like next week.
True. I'm going to open up to the floor in terms of asking a few questions. So I don't know whether anybody's got a question.
How do you manage the process of firing the first couple of employees?
So one of our core values is being open and honest, right? So I'll be open and honest to you. It was very terrible. We in the beginning, because we had no clue and we were scaling up massively, we made a lot of, I would say, mediocre decisions in terms of hiring. So some of our first employees that we hired are actually still with the company and have excelled and grown massively. Some of them, were big mistakes from our side because they didn't fit into our culture, or they didn't fit into our growth trajectory, and didn't work out over the years, or sometimes also over a couple of months. And I think it's always a very difficult situation to have. I still, to the present day, obviously, I totally dislike laying people off. It's a necessary evil that you have to do in order to keep a healthy company balance, and no bigger company gets around without doing that, but I think it should be the last resort. I always think about, when I lay people off, the first thing that comes to mind is, those are the moments when I get very personal. I actually ask them, I give them a very clear reason, number one, for why the decision has been made and why it's not reversible. Then number 2, I try to work out an exit plan, how they can leave the company and how they can set off to, sort of like new opportunities, and then see, how I can help them do that. I always help people that we lay off getting the next jobs. I always, provide references. I always let them use my network, or I encourage our, supervisors of these employees, if I'm not the direct responsible person, to actually facilitate that process. I think being fair with employees is very important because there's this very good song from Justin Timberlake, right? What comes around goes around, and you should be very mindful of that. I think the people that you fire one day might be the people that will hire you at some point later, right? I always try to be very careful and maintain that personal and human relationship. I think it's very important. You always have these reports of these wild orgies of CEOs firing people and stuff, and that's typically the sign of very bad leadership, I would say. And I think the process has to be very controlled. On the flip side, whenever we laid people off, my initial thought was always, how can we make the hiring better so we don't have to do that? How can we make better hiring plans, a better hiring structure, better onboarding structure, better growth structure, that kind of stuff. And in the beginning, we were totally terrible at that, but that's what we learned from the first people that we had to lay off, that we need to get better at recruiting. We need to get better at, getting the right people to the company, interviewing based on culture and based on our mission and passion and the vision, and then really being very selective around that. Most startups, and I see that all the time in early stage startups, also because of lack of funds, et cetera, are not selective enough. The less employees you hire to achieve your goal, the better of an entrepreneur you are.
Okay, next question. Question at the back.
You told us that you change your business model and the supplier are interested. But on the consumer side, then you just start growing where and why do you think this growth?
We acquired a lot of, so when we relaunched the website in 2010 as a two-sided marketplace, right, where suppliers could sign up and list activities, and on the flip side there was a consumer website, GetYourGuide.com, where people could go to and book those activities. We literally, with getting all that supply and all those suppliers that wanted to be promoted through our platform, we got a lot of content, got a lot of descriptions and pictures and that kind of stuff that was all uploaded to the platform, and turned out that Google likes content, and with content you're being indexed in the search engine, and then suddenly, with being indexed in the search engine, Google will give you some organic traffic, and in the beginning these numbers were very low, but then over time, as the business grew and the content base grew and the supply base grew, we also grew the traffic initially through Google, and then afterwards we got better and better of converting these people that came from Google to actually repeat visitors on GetYourGuide that came directly. And then we also explored different other marketing channels. We also started paid advertisement on Google at some point. And then we started our partner network and our affiliate network. So for instance, the TripAdvisor deal where we sort of got people through. So we explored a range of different options of how we could monetize the content that we created, but it all started with the content. And afterwards, the rest was more or less finding profitable avenues of marketing that content online. And I think if you have a good product and a good supply base, chances are that your marketing channels are working. Marketing on the internet, opposed to the belief of many and opposed to my personal belief for the first 2 or 3 years, is actually not rocket science or magic. It's actually just hard work. The thing that is magic is actually getting the right supply and streamlining your processes and making the acquisition of the supply and the unique product that you deliver meaningful. You can really think of the internet like your website like a retail store if you're in e-commerce. I think the retail store is always a very, very good example, and it's something that we think of quite a lot at GetYourGuide. If you have a retail store, the unique thing that differentiates you is really the products that you have on the shelf and the customer service and stuff like the processes that you have in terms of building up that store and where you put the candy bars and where you put sort of like the newspapers or, where you put your great clothes or whatever it is that you're selling. And then getting the people into that store is really just, so by choosing the right location and paying a lot of rent, which is the equivalent of actually starting to do marketing and finding out what where the best marketing and the best sources for you are, where you get the right customers into the door. But the key magic is always in getting this product experience right. People always think the key magic is in the marketing mix, but I think it's all in the product.
Did you focus on one city or a couple of cities? Was there a focus geographical focus?
Yeah, in the beginning there was a strong geographical focus. We basically looked at where do people travel to, and it's a very clear distribution. The top 40, 50 cities worldwide make a huge proportion of the world's travel, like London, Paris, Rome, Madrid, Barcelona, etc., etc. And we made sure that we had content in these cities, and then we translated that content also in English and in German, and then we got a better and better Swiss consumer base and a better German consumer base, and then we struck our first partnerships, first in Switzerland and then in Germany and then later in the US, and that is how we quickly sort of like got rolling with the first bookings.
What you told us, it appeared that funding came very easily to you. Do you think that is generally the case, or is it really true that European startups have much more difficulty attracting investors than, for example, big companies?
That's a difficult question. I would say it really depends which stage you're looking at, and also really depends on your circumstances and where you're coming from. I would say generally we have a harder time for sure because we have less funds here, particularly for the VC funds. But then if you think about it, we also, particularly here in Switzerland, we have a lot of seed investors and angels. I mean, you barely find another city in the world where you have as many potential investors as in Zurich. I mean, like there are so many high net worth people, also wealthy people who can give you 50,000 K, right, which is a huge amount of money in most other cities in the world, as compared to here in Zurich. So I would say Zurich is actually a fantastic city to start a business. I think it doesn't get much better in the Bay Area or other geographies. However, on the flip side, it gets harder when you do your Series A or your later stage rounds, because that's when you need the professional VCs to come in, and we don't have a lot of that density here, but that's when you have to look at Germany or London and then later the US. We were in the fortunate position that funding did come fairly easily to us. It's not the position most companies are, and I think we got very lucky in that. But it's something that you can optimize for sure. And for great companies will always find funding. Great companies and great teams. I think it's always sort of like the team is very important, and for investors to make the decision whether they want to fund you or not.
Can you share please some numbers about how far did you get when you got this seed money? In terms of suppliers or traffic, where were you when you got this seed money? That were really small numbers, but great team, great presentation, or you got some?
When we got the ZKB money, we were nowhere. I mean, like no bookings. No, as I said, that was very fortunate. Like we didn't have anything. When we did the first official seed round, the 2 million we already had. I can't share you exactly the numbers, but we were already at millions of Swiss francs in revenue. I mean, we were already in stuff like substantive numbers back then.
So the first seed money you only had a presentation.
On a presentation, which is very unusual. I mean, like this was very lucky.
And when you got this first round, what were you in terms of suppliers?
Suppliers, we had, I think, probably approximately like 5,000 things to do on our platform. We now have like 25,000. So it's like roughly like a fifth of the size in terms of supply, not in terms of revenue.
The first 5,000 you got was just very, very seed money.
Yeah, totally. Like the first 5,000 things to do, we actually sort of like called up the supplier ourselves. We literally did everything ourselves. This was like the pure, and you have to do that as an entrepreneur. You have to go through this initial stage where you really are all in and sort of like work day and night and sort of like move heaven and earth just to get the supply base started and to get the first customers of your website, and in our case, sort of like match those two things, so get the marketplace started. Literally as an investor, if I also invest in businesses, the thing that I always look at is, do those people have a good business plan? Are those good people? And do they have some initial proof? Are there some transactions happening? Or, if they are a B2B business, do they have the first B2B clients that use their software? You have to have some initial proof, whatever your metrics are.
So what was the proof when this seed money came? There were 5,000 suppliers and one proof?
Suppliers revenue. Consumers and suppliers. I mean, on the consumer end, we already had, at least a few 10,000s of unique visitors a week, I would say.
And some revenues already started?
Yeah, revenues were already coming in.
And numbers?
Yeah, I just said, so we're in the multi-million Swiss franc range already in revenue per year at that stage when we got the first real round, the 2 million. So you have to have that initial proof. If you don't have that, and that's also one of the biggest mistakes. Entrepreneurs are always starting to talk to VCs when they don't have anything, and it's a waste of time. And the VC will always want to talk to you because they always want to network and stuff, like build a relationship. Because those guys are just like bankers. Bankers also start talking to you when you don't have any money to put on your bank account, just to make sure that you do once you have some money. But at the end of the day, it's a waste of time. Totally focus on your product unless you have the first metrics going that are important to you and you also feel like things are going into the right direction. You won't get VC money. You might get angel money though, and that's probably like the more important thing to get started, is to get a couple of angels who believe in the model and invest in it, as we say in Switzerland, à fond perdu. So you just invest in it because you believe in the guys and you believe in the model, and whether it works or not, that's on a different page. But for VCs, that's not the game. VCs want to invest in you based on metrics.
Okay, we'll have the last question. Yeah.
So you said that you had a couple of millions in revenues when you raised the seed fund, money. Why did you raise money there? You had a couple of millions to raise 2 million.
Yeah, totally. I told you, right? I mean, like we had cost against that as well, right? So there was not like we were just, there was just money trickling in. I told you we discussed that point very heavily, right? So we were like, do we really want to raise money, right? And the key reason we did it was that we strongly believed in the market opportunity. We just believed that, getting additional cash into the company and then investing that cash and growing, like hiring more great people, spending more marketing dollars will, at the end of the day, make the entire pie bigger, right? I mean, it's always, you can think of it like, you give away a piece of the pie, but then is sort of like the pie itself getting bigger or not, right? If your business is sort of like, not growing, then, raising cash is stupid, right? Because then you sort of like you just give away a piece of the pie. But if you can sort of like take the money and then, build your business from a, 5 million Swiss franc business to a 50 million Swiss franc business, then it's a calculation that's worthwhile, right? And this is also how VCs think. So you have to make sure that you think about, does this investment bring me to, a larger stage? So like, does it accelerate my growth tremendously? Because the reality of the market is also, there will be competition. If you have a good business, there will be competition at the end of the day. And, can I fend off that competition, and can I be the market leader, and can I grab the market share quickly enough to be the number one in the market? Most big companies, right, like eBay or like PayPal or like Facebook or even Google, they weren't the first one in the market with that idea. But, obviously due to a great team, due to a great product, and then also due to a lot of financial strength, they typically made it to the top. It's always sort of like a combination of those elements, but I wouldn't underestimate the effect of raising cash to accelerate your growth. Ideally, you want to do it without. I agree. And up to 10 years ago, this was the normal model, which I think makes a ton of sense. If, all the Swiss and the German companies, right, that were built what we call Mittelstand, right, they were all built on, sort of like, they were built on debt capital where people took loans and then invested those loans and paid them back and then grew the company to the next stage. And that works if you have 30 years to build your company. In today's internet world, you have 3 years to build your company. So you have to think how you can do that.
Okay. So just a final question from me before we close off. Do you still play the double bass or get time to?
It's a good question. I actually still have it in my apartment in Zurich. I looked at it yesterday and I felt huge guilt. No, unfortunately not as much anymore. Like I just sometimes take it out and practice. But this is something that that is one of the downsides of being an entrepreneur is, right, that your hobbies and passions are all second priority. You have to make sure that you keep some of them to keep your balance. I think that's very important. But if you really grow a startup, there's one big priority in your life, and that is growing that company, and you're all in.
So now, thank you very much, Johannes, for your time, and I'd just like to give a warm welcome.